In this series, we're building Ice Moon, an immersive experience for Apple Vision Pro. One of the most striking features of our environment is the ringed planet on the horizon. I absolutely love planetary rings. They're one of the most ethereal celestial features, captured so beautifully here by NASA's Cassini mission. Our planet also has a swirling, mysterious atmosphere. Today, we'll use SideFX Houdini's procedural tools in combination with Reality Composer Pro's shader graph materials to start bringing our planet to life. All right, so we're back today in Houdini, and we're going to be working on the planet. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new component builder, and we'll call this Planet Geo. And we'll go inside of this. And the first thing we need is a sphere. So I'm going to plug this in. And at the moment, it doesn't matter too much how big this sphere is. We're going to mess with the size later. I'm going to make it a polygon sphere and turn up the frequency so we've got some nice contours. And in a later episode, we'll look at some more optimizations. But for now, this works fine. And we're going to start working on the surface of this. So we look at the concept art. We've got these kind of gas giant bands of clouds and storms that look really swirly and interesting. And we're gonna look at how to build that. So first thing I'm gonna do is create something called a COP network. And I think this stands for compositing network. It's an area of Houdini that a lot of people are intimidated by, but it's pretty powerful and pretty simple once you know how it works. So if you don't already have this composite view here, you can go to New Pane, tab type, Viewers, Composite View, and you'll get this view. And if we create a ramp RGB node, we're gonna see something immediately, and it's gonna be this color ramp. We can control it here. And this is basically a way to procedurally create texture maps in Houdini. It's sort of like Photoshop, but with nodes that drive everything. First thing we're gonna do here is change this to a vertical ramp. And we are going to start to give these the colors from our concept art. And we don't have to be really specific right this second, because we can tweak this. One thing I am going to do is I'm going to take the same color for the beginning and the end, just in case we want to tile this so that it's seamless. And then we're just going to create color bands across the surface of this, basically a gradient. And we can move these around. We give them slightly different shades. And I'm just going for something where we're going to have some variation, across the planet's surface. All right, so we'll start with that. And again, we can come back and modify this as much as we want. Okay, so the next thing we want to do here is displace these clean, perfectly horizontal bands of color to make them more cloud-like. So I'm going to bring in a UV map, and this node's going to give us the UV position. You can see that it's going from -1 to +1 here. And if we plug that in, we're going to get the exact same thing we currently have, because that's by default what the ramp is using for its position. To make this interesting, we're going to bring in a noise, fractal noise, and we're going to add it to the UV coordinates, and you can see what happens immediately. So what this is doing is it's using the noise not for its color, but to distort these UV coordinates. And if we turn down the amplitude, you can see what happens as you turn it up or down, and you're displacing the textural coordinates and creating these cool swirls in those color bands. The other thing I'm going to do is turn the center down. And so rather than having this noise centered at 0.5, I'm going to bring it down to 0. So we've already got something cool. You can experiment with things like the element size of the noise and get different effects. By playing with that, you kind of almost get a sense of what it could look like animated. and we'll just stick with something like that for now. And then on the ramp itself, we have a number of cycles. So if we were to increase this, you see what happens there. It's clamping to the end. So if we repeat, then we can decide how many of these patterns we want. We can repeat them. We can play with the phase value to shift that. And already you can see we're getting some pretty cool effects here. Okay, so that's step one. We're gonna go back out to our geo, switch back over to our scene view. Now, how do we actually put this on here? Okay, so the first thing we need to do is give this sphere some texture coordinates. And this is gonna tell Houdini how we wanna wrap that image we just created around the sphere. Okay, by default, it's gonna do an orthographic projection along the y-axis. So it's like if you're looking down on it, it looks great because it's just projecting texture coordinates, but you can see it starts to look weird from other angles. For now, we're gonna do polar projection. And at a later time, we might change how we're doing the texture mapping, but this will work for today. And I'm gonna click Fix Boundary Seams to correct that weirdness where the texture wraps. So now that we have texture coordinates, we can create a quick material inside of here so that we can preview our texture on the surface. Okay. Normally for base color texture or any of these, you would put in a file you can browse and pick a file, but we actually want to use this cop net we created. And we're going to call this planet surface net. And we need to, instead of a file path, we're going to provide a path to this node. Now this is a little clunky, but I'll just show you. We're going to do a path and we're on the stage inside of a node called planet geo. Inside of that, we're actually in the SOP net, geo once again, planet surface net. Okay, it's a little convoluted, but that's the path to this node. And you can see now we now have our texture map applied to our planet, and it's looking pretty good already. Okay, we want these clouds to move. And in order to do that, we're gonna use something called a flow map. So go back up to this node here, and in between, we're gonna do flow map. If you don't have these installed, quick note, look up how to install the labs toolkit for Houdini. It's not always installed by default. It's easy to get in there, but if that's missing, that's what you need to do. Now, drop down a flow map visualize. Okay. Now by default, it picks this kind of preview texture, this caustic pattern. And if we press play, you can see it's just going to move that pattern across the sphere. And what we want to do is kind of displace this pattern, make it look more like the movement of clouds. But the first thing I want to do is from that quick material, I'm going to copy this path from the quick material to our planet texture and paste that in. Okay, so now we have our planet texture, now it's moving. Okay, but we want to actually move this in a more interesting way. So I'm gonna pause this and we're gonna create another one of these cop networks. And we're gonna call this one planet flow map. Go inside of here and create a ramp. Create a RGB ramp again. And the color of this ramp is going to control how the flow map pushes the pixels around. The red channel is going to control the horizontal movement, and the green channel will control the vertical movement. Switch over to scene view and hit play. And nothing happens because we actually have to use this map. So we'll go here and copy this path. And instead of flow map mode color, I'm going to switch to texture. And I'm going to paste in that path, but we're going to change this to planet flow map. And then when we press play, let me turn up the distortion amount, the speed, so we can see what's happening. And you can see we have some things moving this way, we have some things moving that way. And that's a good start. So we're going to go back into the planet flow map. And we kind of want to do a similar thing as before. So I'm going to copy this green. This way we have a ramp that kind of goes up to orange, then back to green, so we can repeat this. So we have a vertical. We're going to do the same thing as before and make this repeating and give it some more bands. And now if we go back to Geo and press play, we can see we've got a lot more layers of movement, and we can turn down the distortion amount a little bit now. So that's starting to get somewhere. The next thing I want to do is same thing we did before with noise. And actually to save time, we'll go back here and we're just going to copy what we had done here with the noise. And we're going to bring that into our flow map. And now we've distorted the flow map a bit. So now when we go back, now you can see we're starting to get some cool marbling effects there. And we can play with the distortion amount. But we have these areas that are kind of sitting still rather than, we have some that are flowing nicely, but then you've got these areas that seem stuck. And the reason for that is that this noise is a little too extreme. So if we go back here, we can pin this view and we can jump in here and we'll modify things and see the effect here. So if we go to our noise and turn it down a bit. Okay, now we're getting something a little bit nicer than we were before. There we go. And again, we can mess with parameters of the noise, like the element size. We can experiment a little bit with the color to get the effect we're going for, and really just kind of artistically play around with these values until we start to get something that we like. So that's already starting to look pretty good. Come back here, adjust the amount of distortion. And now we're really starting to get something that looks a lot more like those gas giant storm clouds. So we've got movement coming in different directions and things really flowing more than before. Kind of fun if you go in and change the number of cycles and just kind of see what happens with it, or offset the phase so you find something nice. You could do the same thing with the color itself. Change the number of cycles. And really just art direct this until it's looking how you want it. For the rings, first thing we want is a plane, just a grid. So we're going to create this grid, and we're going to need another one of these cop nets. And this time we're going to create one for the rings. So we'll call this ring net. Jump in here, go to composite view, and we're going to create another ramp. It can be mono this time because we don't need RGB, we just need one value. And instead of horizontal, we're going to make it concentric. And this gives us a circular ramp. Right now, we have this linear ramp that goes from 0, where it's black, to 1, where it's red. And if we wanted to, we could manually make concentric circles like this, right? But that wouldn't be very procedural. For the number of rings we want to make, it would be a pretty inefficient way to do it. So we're actually going to use a sine wave instead, because a sine wave pattern will create all of those concentric rings that we want. All right, so we have our ramp and we want to make sine waves in this ramp. So here's how we do it. We're going to grab position, map, and we're going to plug that into the ramp parameter. It's going to complain though, because it wants a mono value. So we will extract the first channel, channel 0 of the position, and that takes it from a color value and it will make it a 0 to 1 range. So it's black here at the center and it goes up to 1, 1, negative 1, 1. What we want to do is take this position And we're going to insert a wrangle. This is like the rest of Houdini, you can write code in here. This works with a @C for color value, and we're going to just say that we want the sign of the incoming color value. And then what we want to do is multiply by constant. And so as we raise this constant, it's going to repeat the pattern, and it's going to use that sine wave, and we get concentric circles. And so we can go way up with this value to something like 100, and we get all these concentric circles. Now we don't want them to clip at the edge here, so we'll go back to our ramp, and we're going to use this number of cycles parameter to just kind of scale down the entire thing so it fits. Borrowing a concept from audio synthesizers, we're going to add more of these to themselves, and this will be kind of like additive synthesis, because when you add a bunch of sine waves or any other waves together, you get cool effects, and it's going to do what we want here, and you'll see in a second. So we're going to copy all of this, and we're going to add them together. And by default, it's just going to look almost exactly the same, but it got brighter because we're just adding the same thing to itself. But now if we go to this multiply constant we created before, and we change that value, we're going to start to get a cool overlapping effect here. And we can play around with that. If we want, we can keep it at a relatively high frequency and just create another one of these multiply by constants. And then we can actually just use this slider and kind of interactively move this slider around. And you see some of the rings are thin, some are thicker. We can just keep doing this, and we'll do, a couple more of these additions. And each time we get a more varied thickness to each of these rings. And so this is another one of those things you can just mess around with until it looks right. What we also want to do here, at the end of this chain, we're going to add one more ramp. It's going to be a mono ramp. It's going to be another concentric ramp. And we're going to use this to control where the rings are visible. So we'll multiply everything we did before by this new ramp. And this one we will just do kind of manually, because this one we want to be able to play with these values until they look about right. Now, something to point out here is that by default, these are usually linear ramps, and we don't really want that. We want something more like, we'll choose Catmull ROM, and it's going to use a spline curve instead, and we get just a nicer look. Linear just looks harsh. So we can control where the major parts of the rings are, and we can do this in a painterly kind of art-directed way. So we leave space for the planet there. We've got this gap in between that ring and the next one. So now if we jump back out to Geo, switch our view to scene view, we once again have to give some texture coordinates to our geometry. So we'll do UV texture again. This time we can just stick to that orthographic projection. We'll do quick material. And so I don't have to type that whole path again. We're going to copy the path and just change that last part. Change that last part to planet, or we called it ring net. And select this node, and now we see our rings. All right, so now, I'm making kind of a mess here, but we'll move this up. And we're gonna merge these things together. And now we can go back to that sphere and scale it up a little bit. It's starting to look like something. We can use the same exact texture we made for opacity as well. Now we can see through the rings. So now we've got our major elements. If we want to see this in a nicer Karma rendering with lighting, we're going to have to add some name nodes here. So we'll call this one rings. We'll call this one planet. And then if we go out to the stage, unpin our view here so we can actually see. Okay. So those quick materials don't work in Karma. What we need to do is actually assign some materials at the Karma level. And this will be useful because these will be material X materials that will mostly transfer over to Reality Composer Pro with just a few little changes. So we're going to go into Material Library and we're going to create a Material X builder, and we're going to call this one Planet. I'm going to go back here because we're going to need that path again to the material, to the texture for the planet surface. So we go back here, go to this Material X network we made. We're going to put an image in, and we're going to paste that path into the file name, and we're going to bring it into base color. Great, but it's applying it to everything, which is not exactly what we want. So now we're going to go to this assign material node, and we're going to make this an explicit assignment. So we want to do asset, geo, planet, and for the material path, it's asset, MTL, planet. So now it's only applying that to the planet. And we're basically going to do the same exact process, but this time for the rings. So we got our rings, but we also need them to be not just color, but we want them in our opacity. So you go to geometry, opacity. There we go. Now the planet doesn't need any specularity here, so we're just going to set that to 0 for now. And then we can add a merge, so we can bring in a distant light. We'll merge that in. And now we've got a distant light. We can control its angle. We can make it more like it is in the concept art, where you've got this sort of profile. And then the planet itself was a bit tilted in the concept art, so we'll add a transform. Now originally in the concept art, we were kind of looking at the underside of the rings, but after playing around with this, it's just generally nicer, I think, to see the top side of the rings, because then we're going to get nice shadowing on there too. Turn this grid off so we can actually see what's going on here. All right, pretty much got our major elements in place now. When we go here and select the planet component and save to disk, the nice thing about using these copnets is it's actually going to render out texture maps for those procedural images we created. So we don't have to export those manually. It'll do that for us. If we want them to be a different resolution, so I'll go select the ring net, we can actually override. By default, it's 1024. By 1024, we can make these, 4K images, so they're nice and sharp on Vision Pro. And when we hit export and save to disk, it's going to generate all those images for us, and it's going to package them up nicely. So I'm going to work on this a little bit more, just dial in the details, and then we'll head over to Reality Composer Pro, where we can start bringing this to life. All right, so we're back in Reality Composer Pro, and I've created a new scene called Planet Test so that we can work on this planet in isolation. I've dragged the planet folder containing our USD asset from Houdini into our project here. And I'm just going to drag planet USD to the root, and we'll zoom out a little bit. And you'll see it looks a little odd right now. And that's because we need to do a little bit of work on the materials. Now, if we go under the planet here in the hierarchy, and we see material, we have a planet material and rings material. So we'll select planet and go into shader graph, and we'll see that we've actually got some stuff going on here already. And this is the Material X shader we created in Houdini. Now, it doesn't take much to fix this. We just need to change this unsupported surface to something like a preview surface. So we'll open that up and we'll replace that, delete it. Now this is our color map, but this file's missing, and that's because the EXR files that were exported from Houdini are quite large, so I converted it to a PNG. So if we go into the planet folder, we can find the PNG. And now if we drag that to our diffuse color, we'll have that on the planet surface. So not a lot of changes to make, and what's nice is you can do a lot of work on the Houdini side, and then with a few tweaks, get it working pretty easily over in Reality Composer Pro. If we select the rings, similar stuff going on here. So I'm going to use an unlit surface for now for this. And similarly, rings EXR, we're going to change to the PNG file. And I had created this remap in Houdini, and I'll show you that in a moment, but first we're going to connect that to color, and we're going to connect the file to opacity as well. But you see, we can't actually do that because opacity wants a single floating point value, and this is a RGB texture. So we're going to create an extract node here, which will just grab the first channel, the red channel, and we'll plug that into opacity. And now we've got our rings. So you'll notice the rings aren't black and white, and that's what this remap is doing. So it's taking the in, low, and high, which is black to white, and then it's remapping it. And I picked these colors to better match the concept art. And we can get going on the surface of the planet and making these clouds come to life. So I'm going to go back into the planet shader. Now, in order to make this work, we need that flow map that we created, and it didn't make it over. So I'm going to go grab that from Houdini and bring that into the project. So we're back and we've got the flow map, and we're going to make this start to animate. Okay, so now I'm going to bring an image node into our shader, and I'm going to grab our flow map. Okay, so by default, this is using the texture coordinates from our geometry, and we want to use this flow map to distort those texture coordinates. Now, the type is important. We want to set that to vector 2f. And we're going to be using the red channel and the green channel from this image to distort the U and V texture coordinates. So if we were to just grab this and we'll add it, and we'll add it to our model's texture coordinates. And if we plug this in, we'll see right away that we've got some distortion happening. And it's static, so we're going to want to bring in a time node. And if we multiply this flow map by time, and we add that to our texture coordinates, now we see some movement, but it's too much. It's glitching out. So this is because the time node is bringing in time as a very large number, and we just want the fractional part of it. So we want a value that's just going to constantly go from 0 to 1, and we can use a fractional node for that. And when we plug that in, we have something that's a little more coherent. It's still pretty chaotic, but it's getting somewhere. So the first thing we can do is we can multiply the time to slow it down a little bit, just so we don't have to stare at this thing going crazy this whole time. Okay, so we've slowed it down. Let's slow it down even a little bit more. Okay, first thing I notice is that this banding is happening, and that's because this texture map is set to periodically repeat, and it's possible that our texture is not perfectly seamless in the vertical direction. So I'm going to switch that to mirror, just kind of a cheap fix, but it will work. And now we don't have that problem anymore. Okay, but we still have more things to address. First, these red and green values go from 0 to 1, and we want the texture to distort in both directions. So right now everything's positive. So what we want to do is we actually want to multiply these values by 2, and then we want to subtract 1. And now that will take our values and it will move them in both directions. So now we have clouds moving in 2 different directions. Okay, then the next thing is we want a way to control the intensity of this distortion. So if we multiply before we do all of this, actually, I'm going to put this after our correction that we did here. And now we can bring in a floating point number, and we'll call this distortion. And that gives us a nice, easy way to control how much to distort. And we can slow that down. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere, but you might have noticed that there's a pop that happens. So I'm going to speed the time up a little bit again so we can see that pop. And what's happening is, remember, we're using that fractional amount, and when it gets to 1, then it goes right back to 0, and we get that flicker, and we don't want that. And so to fix this glitch, we're going to want to copy what we've done and create a second version of it, and then ping pong between those 2 versions and fade between version A and version B to hide that seam. So we're going to start by offsetting this scaled time by ½ a second. Then we're going to take the fractional time of that. We're going to basically copy all this from above. So we'll take this multiply node and we'll bring in our flow map, multiply it by time. We'll do the same thing with our texture coordinates. So bring our texture coordinates in and distort them by this offset time. We need another version of this color map, and we'll plug this in. And then I'm going to tint this color map so we can actually see what's happening. So I'm going to remap it, and now we're going to mix these 2 maps together. Okay, now what we want to do is drive this mixture value by something dynamic, and we're going to use this time to do it. So we'll take this fractional time here, and we're going to multiply by 2 and subtract by 1, which is the same thing we did up here with the texture map, but we're doing it here to time now. And we're going to take the absolute value of this and plug this into the mixture. So now what we should see is no more temporal seam as it fades from one version of this map to the other, and it hides that repeat. I'll get rid of this remap so we'll just see something closer to what we're aiming for here. And now we've got some nice swirling clouds on the surface of this planet. And we've got a couple of variables we can control here, like how fast it is. We could speed it up. We could slow it way down. And we could play with the distortion amount similarly to get different effects. Be sure to like and subscribe. There's so much more on the way.